Hello, my name's Dan Largent, and I'm the author of two novels. The first is called Before We Ever Spoke, and the second is called After Edgewater. How I became an author is probably every bit as interesting as the books themselves. I'm a teacher by trade. I'm also a husband, a father, and a coach. And over the years, I coached football and baseball at the high school level in Olmsted Falls, where I teach. And there was always something in the back of my mind where I wanted to write. I've wanted to be a writer ever since I was little. My mom used to buy me little blank books that were hardcover white books with blank pages on the inside, so you could basically write your own children's book. And so I used to love getting those because I always had stories. The main issue with me, though, and this would kind of become a foreshadowing of events to come as an adult, is that I rarely ever finished them. I was really good at starting them. I would get an idea in my head and I would run with it, and I'd be all geared up. I'm going to write a book, and I'd get about a third of the way through, maybe even halfway through, and then something else would catch my eye. And so I started a lot of books. I started a lot of writing, but I never finished. And that continued on really into high school and into college. From time to time, I would get an idea for a story. When I drive, I like to listen to music, and I like to think of stories. And as a kid, my mom would always take me to the library. And to this day, the library is still a very special place for me. And I used to think, man, wouldn't it be cool someday to have one of my books in the library so people could check it out? And thankfully, that's come true. My books are available in libraries from Cleveland all the way down to New Orleans. And it's pretty wild when you think about it. Something happened after I stopped coaching baseball. I coached high school baseball up until 2017, and my kids were getting older, and I was missing a lot of I have three kids, Brooke and Grace, and a son, Luke, and my two daughters were getting into sports and activities, and I was missing a lot of that stuff, so I decided to step down from coaching. What I found was I had a lot more time than I was used to having, especially at night when, maybe in the past I would have been coming up with the right lineup to play the next day or doing stats or whatever. And it got me thinking, you know what? There was a book I started writing probably around 2005, give or take, and I made it about 8 or 10 chapters in. And I decided, you know what? I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna write a book. And so I decided to do it. And I didn't tell anyone. Very few people knew. My wife knew I was writing from time to time. I would usually write late at night, 10 p.m. when the kids were asleep, or I tend to wake up early, so sometimes 5:30 a.m. I'd hammer out a chapter before I got ready for work. If we were out of town for something, I'd wake up early and go down to the hotel lobby and type there. And I've written in a lot of very interesting places across the state of Ohio and also in other states during this journey. But one thing that kept bringing me back was I just wanted to be able to say I wrote a book. But I also didn't want to be the guy who told everyone that he was writing a book and then never actually wrote the book. So that's why I told very few people. Eventually, I got about 45 chapters in, and my first book's 90 chapters. They're short chapters. I wrote a book selfishly, the way I like to read books, which are short chapters that keep the story going. And I got about halfway through, and that's when I realized, you know what, I think I can do this. And I was about to turn 40, and it was on my bucket list. And it truly was just a bucket list thing to do. And so I spent the next 6 months, every waking moment I could, writing the next 45 chapters. And at the end of it, I had a book, and I didn't know what to do with it then because I had never written a book. I had no idea what the next step would be. So I did what I thought was best in that situation, and I contacted my favorite professor from college. His name's Dr. Jim Gorman, and he's a writer himself. And I said, hey, I want to send you something, and I want you to be brutally honest with me on it, and tell me what you think. And I really, I wrote this book, and I don't know. I want to see if it's any good. Should I bother, publishing it? Whatever. So I sent it down to him, and he got back to me really quick, actually, within a few days. And he, in the same vein that he was the best writing teacher I had ever, let alone just in college, but ever. He gave me a chapter by chapter breakdown, and he was kind where he needed to be, and he was firm where he needed to be too. If he thought something was, silly, he said, yeah, you don't need this, take it out. And it gave me the confidence, because at the end he said, you wrote a damn good book. He said there were times that I had author's jealousy. And for him to say that to me really gave me the confidence I needed to go forward with it. And I said, well, what should I do? Should I try sending it to publishers and things like that and see what happens? And he said, well, what's your end game here? Do you just want to have a book in your hands? Or is it really important for you to be, published by a big publishing house? And I said, I just want to have a book in my hands. I had no expectations for it whatsoever. And he said, well, self-publish it then. Do it yourself. He said, there's all sorts of avenues out there. And so I started to look into it, and found someone to design a cover, found an editor, and ended up self-publishing it through Amazon, which really, I tell people all the time, it only cost me a few $100 up front to publish my first book. So the next thing that came about was actually telling people that I wrote a book, because I think a lot of people weren't going to believe me at first, or think I was like joking, or it was an April Fool's joke or whatever. So this was summer of 2018, and I said, well, I'm going to put it on Facebook. And before I did that, I actually did tell my mom. I said, hey, by the way, I wrote a book. It's coming out in 2 weeks, and I just thought I'd let you know. And she was like, what? And so I put it out there on Facebook to, my wide Facebook friend audience, and said, here's the link. When it goes live, it'll be paperback and Kindle. And, if you're interested, buy it. And I didn't think anyone was going to buy it. I really didn't. I thought, if I make the $300 or whatever it was I spent up front on it, and I break even, it'll be worth it, because all I really cared about was having a book. And in the dedication, I tell my kids that I wrote it for them, and I say, I started writing this book before you were born, but I finished writing it because you were born. And that's very important to me, because I wanted to show them that even at age 40, that, it's never too late to chase your dreams, to dream big. And that's why whenever I autograph books, I always write dream big. And so my whole goal was to be able to, someday maybe they would dust off a copy of it and show one of their friends and say, my dad wrote a book. And that's really what the motivation was. Well, what happened was, big response, once people got over the shock that I actually wrote a book. And you could see on Amazon, when you self-publish through Amazon, I could actually see like how many copies were being sold. And, within the first few days, hundreds of copies were being sold. And then panic started to set in a little bit, because I thought to myself, I convinced myself that I didn't care if people liked it or not, that I was doing this just for me, and it was a bucket list item and all that stuff. And I was lying to myself, because once I realized that people had bought it and that they might actually crack it open and read it, let's just say I was physically sick for a couple days. You know, it was all I could think about. I didn't want to come out of my house, and you know, I started having, you know, mild anxiety attacks over, oh my God, what if people read this and go, oh yeah, Largent, yeah, he wrote a book, but it stinks, but yeah, he wrote one, and you know, and I become the butt of jokes or something like that. And then a strange thing happened. People started writing reviews, and my friends who were reading it were texting me as they read it, and a lot of them were prefacing it with, "I can't believe how good this is," which, you know, was kind of a backhanded compliment, I guess, but they really were thrilled with it, and they loved the book, and they're like, "Oh, you got to write another." And when I wrote the first book, Before We Ever Spoke, I actually ended it in a way where the story could continue on, or it could just be one of those endings where the reader gets to figure it out. And but I did leave the door open. Well, things really started to take off from that point. There were some newspaper articles. I was live on Lakeside with Holly Strano. I started appearing on, you can see on here, a lot of different radio and TV stations. So I started writing the next book. I was, man, I'm gonna knock it out, and I did. But then, you know, as big and as bold as it got right off the bat, most authors will tell you, you know, it's that first month where it's really awesome when you release a book, but then it kind of, you know, and then I started to maybe think, oh, did I get my hopes up too much, you know, because, you know, at first I didn't care if anyone bought it, I didn't care if anyone read it, and then once they did and they enjoyed it, then it became, okay, well, I want to see how far this can go. And then it, you know, it plateaued pretty quick. I wouldn't even say plateaued, it nosedived pretty quick. You know, very few sales, and the TV shows and radio interviews stopped coming as much. And so I decided, you know what, and this is kind of I guess the way I live my life, I decided just to go for it myself and start reaching out to people, and start reaching out to producers and things like that, and see if I could get on some shows. And so I wrote off a bunch of emails and didn't hear back from pretty much anyone. But the one that I really was hoping to be on was Jim Donovan, because, you know, every Cleveland sports fan grows up, you know, listening to Jim Donovan, and I thought, oh, it'd be great to be on his show. And but I wrote and never heard back. So it's about January now, about 6 months passed by, and all of a sudden, out of the middle of nowhere, I get an email from Jim Donovan's producer, and he says, hey, Jim is starting a series where he has Cleveland area authors on. He's going to have, you know, Terry Pluto and a couple other well-known guys, and then you. You're the third one in line. And I'm like, whoa, okay. And so I went on Jim Donovan, and what a great experience. And I got to take my daughter down there with me. And that night, just to show you the power of a show like that, is it was back in the top 40 on Amazon for their bestsellers list. And it had not been there. It was at like number 1,200 or something before that, and it shot it back up. And so then that kind of gave me the boost I needed to continue to write the second book and reach out to more places. And that's how I ended up going on a book tour down in the Gulf Coast, because one of my main characters is from a place called Pass Christian, Mississippi. And Hurricane Katrina plays a big part in the first book. And so a lot of Gulf Coast stations were interested in having me on. So I was on TV in Biloxi and Mobile and Gulfport, some smaller towns there. But then CBS New Orleans made my book their #1 book for the month of May. And so I got to film a segment on the French Quarter where part of my book takes place with CBS New Orleans, and that was a really cool thing. And signed some books at a bookstore down there. So I had my first official book tour, which was really neat. The second book came out, and it had the same type of a success early on, and libraries started carrying my books, and it just really was, it's really been a really wonderful ride for me, and I love going to libraries to give talks. I go to book clubs that like to have me out and talk to them, not just about my journey, but about the books, and answer their questions. And I'm currently working on the third book. It'll be the third and final book of this series, because there's some other projects I really would like to work on too. But I definitely want to see this series through to the end. But after writing 2 books in 2 years, basically, I decided, you know what, I'm going to take my time a little bit more on this third one, and so that's what I've done. The books themselves, the first one, where it all started, is called Before We Ever Spoke. And the main character in the series is named Cooper Madison. Now, he is a Major League Baseball player. He's a pitcher, and it starts off for Chicago. And he is the best pitcher in the game. And as I kind of alluded to earlier, he's from Pass Christian, Mississippi, which was completely devastated by Hurricane Katrina. And so that plays a big part in the book. This book takes place in 2006, so shortly after, you know, Hurricane Katrina. And he's out of baseball. He leaves baseball because of a tragic loss in his life. And so his father was actually from Cleveland originally, and so he decides, you know what, I'm gonna just go kind of hide out in Cleveland, and he rents a penthouse and overlooking the lake at the fictional Westcott Hotel, which is you know, kind of a mix between some other famous Cleveland, you know, the old Cleveland hotels. And so he is seeking refuge in Cleveland and just trying to get his head right and find, you know, what his purpose is. I mean, he walked away from baseball at the very top of his game. And while he's there, he's become kind of a shut-in. And one day, a girl, who's the other main character, her name's Kara Knox, she's working as a delivery driver for a restaurant called Stuckey's Place. And so she's a Cleveland State, senior at Cleveland State, college student, making some money on the side, and she delivers food to his door. Without giving too much away, eventually they end up striking up a little bit of a friendship. And there's something about this girl, Kara, you know, who I think in the book I say something along the lines to describe Kara that, you know, she may not stand out in a crowd, but if you ever met her in person, you'd never forget her. So she's that type of beauty. But she's also spunky. She's not afraid to speak her mind. And Cooper Madison, the main character, he really falls for her. And so they begin dating. Now there's a whole nother part of the book that comes into play, and it doesn't come in until about halfway through the book, but it does tie everything together, and that is Kara's brother happens to be a detective. His name's Jason Knox, and he is a Cleveland police detective in the 1st District, and there's been some issues with bodies washing ashore at Edgewater Park. And so he is on that case. And so they start to realize that, you know, there's someone out there, you know, killing people, and they're washing ashore. And so this killer gets named the EPK, the Edgewater Park Killer. And the case kind of really takes Cleveland by storm. And, you know, everyone's kind of afraid of the EPK and when he's going to strike next. And so that's the other plot that's going along with Coop and Kara's relationship. And the two really intertwine well together. And it really turns into a fast-paced page turner as the book goes, and reaches a crescendo in not just the EPK case, but also Coop and Kara's romance. I'm going to read a small part from Before We Ever Spoke, before I talk about After Edgewater, which is the sequel. And this is where Coop and Kara are on their first date. You'll have to forgive my southern accent if I don't nail it right. Lake Erie looks amazing from up here, Kara Knox said as she gazed out over Cleveland's Great Lake from the balcony of Suite 1100 at the Westcott Hotel. The sun was setting over the horizon as Cooper Madison leaned against the stone balcony next to Kara. I try to catch every sunrise and sunset out here. It reminds me of home. I used to love watching the sunset over the Gulf. I don't blame you, Kara replied. It's breathtaking and peaceful. Seeing it from up there reminds me of something my dad used to say, Kara laughed. Lake Erie is like a pitching wedge, good from about 150 yards out. That's funny, Coop chuckled. It definitely is not as pretty up close. The last time I was on the shore over at Edgewater Beach, I almost stepped on a syringe and about a dozen used condoms. That sounds about right, Kara responded. Can I ask you something? That's the second time you referred to your father as if he's no longer with us. Why? Sorry, I guess it's just a force of habit, Kara replied. My dad is alive, but in a lot of ways, the man he used to be died about 5 years ago. How do you mean? He was in a bad accident on the job at the Ford plant. He ended up in a wheelchair, and he hasn't been the same since. It's like he's just given up in a lot of ways. Dear Lord, I'm so sorry to hear that, Coop replied. Well, that's why I work at Stuckey's. I'm in my senior year at CSU, and the money has been tight since the accident, so I work for Stuckey to help out. He used to work with my dad at Ford long before the accident. Do you like college? Coop asked. Yeah, but I'm ready for it to be over. And sometimes I wish I would have gone to college, even for a year, Coop said as he looked out over the lake. Well, I think you made the right choice, Kara laughed. Yeah, I know I did, Coop relented, but I do feel like I missed out on a lot of stuff. Well, as someone who didn't miss out on those things, I can assure you that they weren't as great as you might have imagined. But I do get where you're coming from. What's your major? Coop asked. Business, but I have no idea what I'm going to do. You fixing to take over corporate America? Well, right now I'm just fixing to land an internship this winter and finish my degree, Kara laughed, mocking Coop's choice of progressive verb. I can't help the fact you don't know the proper way to talk, Coop joked. What do you say if you're planning on fixing something, Kara mused. Well, I suppose I'd be fixing to fix it, Coop laughed. I give up. Please don't. Coop deadpanned, his words immediately signaling a shift in tone before cracking a wry smile at Kara. Same, Kara replied, smiling back. Well, at least we can agree on that, Coop said as he gazed towards the sunset. Nothing, Kara replied. Come again? Coop asked. Nothing, Kara repeated. I say it when I agree with something, but I know no matter what words come out of my mouth, they won't do it justice. So I just say nothing. And that's my way of saying that whatever the other person said was perfect. Nothing, Coop said. I like that. Nothing, Kara agreed. And that phrase, nothing, appears throughout the book. It's kind of their thing. They represent new love. And when you're newly in love, food tastes better, music sounds cooler, everything is awesome. So they have, their little phrase that they like to share with each other, and they use it. And of course, there's going to be some trials and tribulations for them. I mean, when you're a college student in Cleveland and you're dating arguably the most famous pitcher in baseball, sooner or later the paparazzi and news outlets are going to get word of that, and so there are some obstacles. And then especially when those same media outlets find out that Kara's brother is working the Edgewater Park killer case, so you can imagine there's some twists and turns in there, and there's also some really great ancillary characters. There's a guy named Clarence who is the head of security that Coop ends up hiring as like a bodyguard for he and Kara, and he's also kind of like a wise sage who helps helps them through some stuff, and he plays an important role in their lives. As mentioned in the reading, Kara's father was severely hurt in an accident, which leaves him in a wheelchair. And so that has an impact on her life, not just hers, but also her mom's. And, as her mom takes care of him, but he's not, let's just say he's not the best patient in the world for her. And so, there's just so many layers to it. And I guess the best compliment I've received on my books is did a podcast with a guy named Hank Garner, and he does something called Author Stories Podcast, and he's had pretty much everyone on that you can think of. And he said, the best part about your books is they're multi-genre, and that you can't pigeonhole your books into romance or sports fiction or a murder mystery or a suspense. He's like, it's all that stuff. He's like, it's all that stuff rolled into one story that really kind of appeases to a wide audience. And I think that's why my book, my first book and the follow-up After Edgewater, I think that's why they had the success they did. Was there's something there for everyone to latch onto. So if you really like reading a romance book, it's got it. It's definitely not 50 Shades type of romance. But it's got it. If you are into suspense, it's got that. Crime, it's got that. Sports, it definitely has that. So it has all of that rolled into one. The second book, After Edgewater, picks up where the first book leaves off, where Before We Ever Spoke leaves off. And the title's kind of telling because at the end of Before We Ever Spoke, without giving anything away, there is a very climactic scene that happens at Edgewater Park. So this book kind of picks up where it left off on what the aftermath is because of what happened there. And we learn that things might not always be what they seemed in the first book, especially in regards to the EPK. And this book is definitely not as fluffy as the first book. It is a little bit darker. It's not like super dark. It's not my personality, but definitely a little bit darker. The EPK case is in it from the beginning till the end, along with Coop and Kara, who have now been together for a while, and the trials and tribulations that they're going through on top of everything. It's to be quite honest, it's my highest rated book. It hasn't sold as many copies as Before We Ever Spoke, I think, because a lot of people probably just bought the first one when, the novelty was there that I wrote a book. But if I was ever going to get judged on my writing, I really feel I grew as an author with After Edgewater, and so I'm very proud of it. And I really hope that people who enjoyed Before We Ever Spoke check out After Edgewater, because it will tie up a lot of loose ends. It'll answer a lot of questions that they had. But because it is the second book of a series, it will raise some more questions going into the third book, which will be the final of the series. I have fallen in love with writing about Cooper Madison and Kara Knox and Clarence and Grace Brooks, who I named after my daughters. She's a very strong female character. It's important to me to have strong female characters in my books. And it's also important for me to have flawed humans in my books, like people who are good people, but they have their flaws. They're not perfect. You look at a guy like Cooper Madison. I mean, he's what every kid wants to be. I mean, he's the best player in Major League Baseball, and he's got the good looks, and he's got it all. But you realize that he has his own struggles that he's going through as well, and so it's important to see him in that light as well. There's a new character that gets introduced in After Edgewater named Hannah LaMarca, and she's a reporter, a TV journalist for one of the local TV stations here in Cleveland, and she becomes a big part of the plot as well. And I really enjoyed coming up with that character as well. It's been a wild ride, and I hope to see it continue. If you have not read Before We Ever Spoke or After Edgewater, please go to your local library and check it out. You could also purchase them on Amazon in paperback and Kindle. They're available really everywhere online. I know Barnes & Noble, Walmart, all those places carry them online. Sometimes they're in stores, sometimes they're not. There's a lot of local bookshops around here that carry them. So please, support those local businesses as well. And Before We Ever Spoke is also available on Audible. It was important. I love audiobooks, so it was important to me to have my first book on Audible. So I hired a production company, and they put it out there. So you could also use one of your monthly credits and download Before We Ever Spoke on Audible. But I really appreciate Lakewood Library for having me out. Libraries are so important, not just to me, but really to the fabric of our communities. They provide so many services. My sister worked for Cuyahoga County Public Library for years, so I know firsthand all the amazing services that libraries perform for the community. It's not just books and things like that, but the programming that they put forth, and giving someone like me an opportunity to connect with you is really special. So I appreciate it so much. And you can learn more about me on danlargent.com, and you can find links to my TV and radio and podcast interviews and all that good stuff. So I really appreciate you having me out, and hopefully you'll enjoy the books.